Hello, good afternoon. I hope you've had a good lunch, but not too good, because this is going to be a very interesting session for all of us. I'm normally, you see me here dealing with heavy South Asian issues or heavy foreign policy issues. Today we're going to get a flavor of the region, and it's a region we all live in, we should know more about, don't know enough about for sure. So if I could, with just a show of hands in the audience, take a look, just so we know, how many of you live in the region, the neighborhood, India and the countries surrounding it? How many of you see an identity for yourself which is not global citizen or Asian, but South Asian? I see a few hands, which is very hopeful. So our guests today are going to speak about their works, but in particular also about how the identity of where their works are based actually, in a sense, breathes into what they write. I've been a journalist for 30 years. It's been my privilege to travel to each of the South Asian countries. So from Afghanistan, Maldives, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and Bhutan and Nepal. So for me, it has always been a reality. It's always been something that I don't have to wonder about whether there is a South Asian identity or not. Obviously, the history, where over historical times, our countries have traveled between ourselves, shared so much in terms of culture, shared religion, shared language. There is no neighboring country of India's where someone in India does not share a language. And it was very interesting to see two of the participants suddenly break off. It is a reality. It's there in our food. It's there in our sense of humor in many ways. And there's a reason why we're able to understand each other even if we don't necessarily speak the same language. But then, of course, in the last few weeks or months, we've been thinking about some of the challenges of the future. And you're hearing about them at some of the other sessions as well, where we talk about where are the big scarcities going to come from? Where are the big solutions going to come from when it comes to climate change, when it comes to dealing with pollution, when it comes to dealing with issues like energy shortages and as well as food shortages. I know these sound like very, very serious issues to deal with when you're talking about identity, but actually the solution to them also comes from regional understanding in a certain sense. So I'm going to start by asking each one of our guests really to tell us a little bit about how the identity of the geographical identity, if you like, of what they, of where they write, feeds into their work itself. And I want to start with you, Ashok. Congratulations for the unmarriageable man.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Suhasini.
And there is so much in your book that lends itself to talking about the identities, or in a sense, the common colonial past versus an imperialist identity. So give me a sense of what it is in your books that you think really comes from this idea of South Asia, or does it not?
Well, I'm one of those strange people who ended up as a writer very late in life. I was 42 when I literally put pencil to paper. So, and I didn't think of myself as a South Asian writer. I was scribbling, essentially. And still today, I think of myself as a writer. But then other people read your books and they say, gosh, there's such a flavor of Sri Lanka here, or there's such a flavor of South Asia, or whatever. And I think, really? And I look through, and then I'm forced to agree. Even the language, although we all speak English, it's a different, each of us speaks a different, slightly different type of English. And we, the writers, don't think of it as being different, but I think readers do. Readers do appreciate that there is a difference. Now, in the case of Sri Lanka, we are in deep, deep trouble here, because it is unquestionably one of the most complex countries in the world. What you see is absolutely not what you get. The title of this session is The Neighbourhood. And I was just thinking to myself, in every neighborhood, there's one household that refuses to conform, The children run about half naked. They have loud parties till late at night. The rest of the neighbors get together and they kind of slightly disapprove of them. But at the same time, they are your neighbors, you know? And the worst is that's the household that can never afford to pay its bills. It lives beyond its means. Does this sound familiar to you? Anyway, so
Sri Lanka is not the only one, though.
Well, I think we win the prize, I think. So there you have Sri Lanka in a nutshell. Almost impossible to quantify, to qualify what makes that an identity. In a way, it's a non-identity. It's what we are not that defines us. So when you look at the rest of South Asia, I mean, this is a huge generalization, but follow me on this one. Indians in general will have certain common opinions on things, common views. Bhutan, small country, so again, very, very cohesive and so on, and Nepal-Sikkim and so on. But Sri Lanka, although it's small, 20 million people, no two Sri Lankans will ever agree with each other on anything. So we're kind of really feisty, individualistic, etc. So where does that leave my writing? I mean, how do I express any type of identity from the writing? I don't know. I mean, that's the real answer. I don't really know. But other people do see something particularly Sri Lankan there. So there obviously is some kind of identity. I'll just read you a little bit, if I may, just to give an idea. In all my books, I try and deal with other things, but the identity comes across peripherally or sort of almost by the by. You get doses of identity coming through. You know, it's like worming syrup or something. You have to give it to the child, sort of disguise it and give it in. This last book of mine, the one that won the prize, is called The Unmarriageable Man, and it's ostensibly about my father and his fight with cancer and my adventures in London, in Mrs. Thatcher's London in the 80s. But actually, it's about none of those things. It is, at its base, it's about grief. But I'm going to read you a little bit about Colombo back then. And I think it might give you a little idea of how different we are from our neighbors. In the case of my parents, sorry, have I got the right place? Let me see. They were not young when they met, my parents, both in their early 40s. Domenica Gaisford, as my mother was known then, was an Englishwoman who met my father in Colombo while visiting a friend. It was a long visit, 3 months at least, and I couldn't help but wonder, had she come out to Colombo in search of a husband? That was how it was done then, you see. Colombo was a sort of entrepot of human flesh, the singles bar of the British Empire, the Las Vegas of the colonies. You met at the Golf Face Hotel, you watched the sunset from the veranda, pink gin in hand, before you crossed the road to St. Andrew's, Scottskirk to sign up, all in the space of a week perhaps. They had a much more constructivist and workmanlike attitude to marriage those days, a professional knowledge of the nuts and bolts of the contraption. Of course you were in it for the pleasures of the ride, like everyone else, but you were well aware of the mechanics purring underneath. And if love happened to sleep in through the cracks in the machinery, it was a delightful bonus, unexpected but welcome, the sweet grease that made the machine run more smoothly. In the case of my parents, however, there was one startling and totally inexplicable difference. She was white, he was black. An extreme act of courage I couldn't imagine either of them capable of back in the Sri Lanka of the 1950s. But then I didn't know them well enough. They were only my parents, after all. It is one of the tragedies of my life that I was neither old enough nor mature enough to ask my mother about this before she died. I would have been more sure of getting at least a semblance of the truth out of her. With him, alas, there was no chance. The Colombo Swimming Club only allowed natives through its doors in 1971, he used to say, barely 9 years ago. That is why I don't step in even today. My friend George Bevan, who performed his ballroom dancing act, wasn't allowed to use the shower afterwards. My father wrinkled his nose. He had to go home smelly. Natives, I said. Natives. That's what they called us back then, Sanjay. Don't be fool enough to imagine, even for a moment, they think of us any differently today. So, of course, you went and married one of them.
Thank you. And there's so many small parts to the book that I enjoy, and I think you will too. If I could come to you, Prajwal, and congratulations on the Gurkha's daughter, the land where I flee. Now, Prajwal is, in a sense, another true South Asian because he's known as an Indian author in English, but he has origins in Nepal and Sikkim. Tell us a bit about how that identity works. Do they clash at all? Because Indians always know about how we look at our neighborhood. We never know much about how our neighbors see us. And you have a little glimpse of that in your writing.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Thank you, Suhasini. I am the son of a Nepali-speaking Indian father and a mother from Nepal. And growing up, I often found myself distancing myself from one identity and embracing another. It was only a lot later as an adult that I realized that it was fun to embrace both the identities fun to embrace both the identities. Now, you must remember, nothing pisses off a Nepali from Nepal more than when the country is clubbed together with India. All right? Nothing pisses off a Nepali-speaking Indian from India more than when someone identifies him as a Nepali from Nepal. So you can well imagine how complicated this identity was. I would go to Kathmandu, where my mom is from, visit my cousins, where I'd be constantly othered. And then, I mean, you're all too familiar with the way popular media in India have depicted Nepali-speaking people over the years. We are either doormen or watchmen or whores or servants or cooks, which are all wonderful things to be, no doubt, but not all that we are. And that is why I embarked on a book like Land Where I Flee, which is about identity, definitely, about national identity, international identity, but also about an upper middle class family that I have not seen, upper middle class Nepali-speaking family that I have not seen depicted in anywhere in popular media. These are Nepalis who live in various parts of the world. You have Nepalis from Nepal, you have Nepalis from Sikkim, Nepalis from Darjeeling, Nepalis from Bhutan, and they've all convened in my Himalayan hometown of Gangtok, Sikkim, and there's a writer character in the book who may or may not be me, who sort of reflects on who they have become as a family. I request your patience, indulgence as I...
Please, please.
Yeah, it's a very short extract, so don't be leaving your seats just yet. I, citizen of the world, not quite. Nepali-speaking Indian, Indo-Nepalese, Indian of Nepalese origin, Gurkhali or Gurkha or Gurkha, terms gaining rapid popularity to describe the Nepali in India, words embraced to chisel out our identity, to distance ourselves from Nepal, old words with new meanings, words meant not to confuse our ethnicity with our nationality, hoping the association that comes from sharing our name with those valiant soldiers doesn't spawn a different kind of identity conundrum. Agastya, my brother, an NRI, a non-resident Indian, Indian about to leap over, insufferable green card holder, poster boy of upper middle class South Asian aspirations, impatient bearer of an Indian passport that will soon be replaced by an American one, the former to be hidden but promised to be turned to authorities, to be flashed on trips to Bhutan, where being non-Indian means having to shell out a pretty penny. Bhagwati, my sister, Nepali-speaking Bhutanese, Lotsampa, Nepali-speaking former Bhutanese, Nepali-speaking refugee, formerly Nepali-speaking Indian, now Nepali-speaking refugee who is almost American and travels on a refugee travel document. Manasa, my sister, Nepali, formerly Nepali-speaking Indian, now Nepali, Nepalese, anglicized or Sanskritized, one and the same thing, the holder of a non-electronic passport, but almost a Brit, soon to be the owner of a powerful Burgundy passport with a fancy coat of arms. And Ama, my grandmother, with no passport, but voters' IDs in Gangtok, in Kalimpong, in Darjeeling. One person who votes in 3 places, 2 states, just in case. Thank you.
I think you're all going to go away from this session looking at identity with so many more layers than we had before. I'd like to turn now to Tshering Tashi, who's from Bhutan. And this is still a part of South Asia, so connected to India in so many ways, and yet often called the last Shangri-La, often thought of as a country off limits for everyone. And somebody who has, over the years and now decades, really painstakingly researched the history, not just of Bhutan, but its connections with the rest of the region. Tshering, just to start with, what really drives your research? Because you look at so many little connections between Bhutan and Sikkim, Bhutan and other parts of the country, and of course the story of the Nana Sahib Peshwa. Give us a sense of why you sought to look outside of Bhutan as well.
In one word, curiosity. Yesterday, Suhasini quoted Sholay. She said, "Hamara paas maa hai." Today, I will quote India's late Prime Minister Atul Bajpai, who said, "You can choose your friends, but not your neighbors." Bhutan has been a standing example where we made our neighbors our best friends. The Bhutanese say, "Bhutan chota desh hai, lekin hamara paas mein parosa hai." For the benefit of the non-Hindi speaking, it means Bhutan is a small country, but we have trustworthy neighbors. My current obsession is with the Indian historical character. His name is Nana Sahib. In 1815, the East India Company put 100,000 rupees bounty on his head. He was outlawed by the East India Company for fighting, for initiating and leading the Sepoy mutiny. Fearing for his life, he fled India to Nepal, and for 17 years took refuge in Nepal with a parade of elephants and 20,000 people with him. So who is Nana Sahib? He was the Peshwar. He was the adopted son of Bajirao II, who fought many battles with East India Company. After being defeated in the Third Marathi War, he took a pension and lived in Bithur, near Kanpur, on the holy banks of Ganges. And at that time, Bithur was considered the Manchester of India. In 1851, when Bajirao II passed away, the British did not acknowledge Peshwa Raja Nana Sahib as the legitimate ruler. So he led the mutiny. Now, what is his connection with Bhutan? So when he was in Nepal, the king of Nepal was not very kind to him. Firstly, he snatched his stunningly beautiful wife, then also took possession of the Nanlaku crown jewel, which at that time was considered valued at 50 lakhs. They said at that time there was nobody rich enough to buy this crown jewel. So he didn't see a life in Nepal, so the next country was Bhutan. So if you visit Bhutan, in the central part of Bhutan, there's an ancient zone called Tongsa. There's a room dedicated, and to this day is called the Peshawar Raja's room. 8 years after the Indian Sepoy mutiny, Bhutan fought its first draw wars with the British. The court astrologer of the father of the first king, who was the strong man of Bhutan at that time, told him that one day there will be a man, darker in complexion, who will be little limb, will come from south. You be nice to him. And it turned out to be Nana Sahib. So Nana, with help of Nana Sahib, Bhutan fought the first battle of the Boer War and beat the East India Company.
And even to modern day, even in more modern day times, we have seen that kind of cooperation. You've written in one of your books about how the previous king, K4, actually went out to fight those who were fighting the Indian state at one point. Do you think it's important to put this history together, but also particularly in English? Why do you think that it's necessary to have it in English?
So Bhutan has over 2,000 monasteries, and most of them are filled with scriptures written in ancient scripts. We don't know what is in it. You need to be patient, you need to be a scholar to translate, and also have the skills to be able to understand the content. Recently, scholars have now started translating, piecing the stories and putting it in English. For example, in the 18th century, a Sikkimese princess with Bhutanese origin ruled Sikkim for 8 years. And had it not been known, had this story not been translated to in English, none of us would have known the story of this Sikkimese princess with Bhutanese origin who ruled Sikkim for 8 years.
Very interesting. You know, we always read about or think about the white man's burden in a certain sense, but more and more, when I look at all of us, I see a certain burden on all of us who are South Asians, who've been, with the exception of Bhutan, colonized in some senses, and still dealing with the idea that we are communicating in English. How much is that a concern for you, Ashok?
Well, I think it's absolutely marvelous that we are communicating in English, particularly in Sri Lanka with our problems. I see English as the language of peace. Actually, it's exactly that, peace, because to speak in your language, whether it be Sinhala or Tamil or whatever else, is seen almost as an act of defiance. So English allows everything to be smoothed over. I don't know whether it's the same in other countries. I'm not sure it is. But in Sri Lanka, certainly, I see English as that language of peace.
I certainly think there's a complexity to it, because there is internally also a sense that we are giving up some part of our heritage by taking somebody else's language, but we're all much more comfortable, clearly, in audiences even like this one, with it. What is your take on it, Prajwal? Because it is somewhere there the sense of guilt that we are eventually communicating in a language that isn't the language perhaps we learnt at first.
But isn't English as much as our language? I think English is as much my language as Nepali is. So it's perfectly fine. I can't think of any other language that Tamil from Chennai and Nepali from Kalimpong can communicate in. I think it's perfectly fine to communicate in English. In fact, we need English. I almost hate to say this, but we do. And I would sooner speak English than Hindi, which is not my language. I'm sorry to say. Nepali is my language, and after Nepali, it's English. That's my language.
Certainly is a different take from some of the more politicized narrative that we hear about these days. I also want to hear, because you saw from the audience, so many of us are actually from India in this audience, of how India is perceived from the neighborhood point of view. It's true, we are the big brother, and how. The difference between, I think India is something like 8 times the size of its next neighbor. And there is always a sort of narrative in India about its neighborhood. I often say, when I speak to foreign policy students, that if I was to put together the mental imagery that Indians have of their neighborhood, it's as if there is India in the middle of the map and a ring of fire around it, because everything is a problem. But it's also important to get that perspective on India from the neighborhood. Prajwal, how do you see it?
Well, these are fraught times. I mean, there's so much debate about cultural appropriation and speaking on behalf of a people who may not be wholly yours. So take what I say with a grain of salt. But I do think that we are perceived as a big bully in Nepal. It's been the case for a really long time. For example, when the 1950 treaty between India and Nepal was signed, it was the Nepalese prime minister who signed it, whereas it was the Indian ambassador who signed it. There is still so much bitterness in Nepal about the fact that it wasn't two prime ministers who signed it in the treaty. Now, what's often happening, what I see happening is that the more insufferable we get,
You have to define when you say we.
India.
Which we? The Indian we.
India, India. I am Indian, and yeah, so there you go. The more insufferable Indians get, the more of an inroads China makes into Nepal. And I was just in Kathmandu. In fact, I was in Kathmandu right before COVID, and I remember how in Tamil, the tourist district of Kathmandu, almost every sign was in Chinese, something that I hadn't seen 10 years ago. I mean, China has a tendency to go into a country and leave it a mess. I hope they don't do to Nepal what they did in Sri Lanka. But yeah, we could have a far gentler approach to our diplomatic relations with our neighbors. I understand that in geopolitics, the bigger country always dominates its smaller neighbors. But if there were a degree of trust between nations, a lot of things could be smoothened out. There is a lot of mistrust in Nepal about India. We are very, very good at issuing economic blockades, trade blockades, every time we're unhappy with something Nepal does. And I mean, that's been the case since the late 90s. It happened in 1989. It likely happened in 2015, although the Indian government says that wasn't the case. So yeah, I wish we were nicer. I wish we were softer.
All right, fairly put. Tshering Tashi, in a sense, the India-Bhutan relationship did not suffer for too long from the iniquity that Prajwal spoke about. There was a revised treaty between the two countries that were signed. And yet, sometimes when I do visit Bhutan, I see some of the misgivings that Prajwal speaks about coming through, particularly when it comes to tourism. And the new tourist policy that sort of puts new restraints on Indians coming in. I know that the relationship is of a very different nature, but how do you see India coming from Bhutan?
Bhutanese are religious and always start the day by a prayer. And how we begin our prayer is Jagar Ketu, which means in the sacred language of, in the sacred voice of India. And Bhutanese reverence for India is so great because it's the birthplace of Lord Buddha. Bhutan and India are different in both in size, in geography, in culture. We're a small country, a small landlocked country with a population less than 1 million. India is now the most populous nation. We are quieter, India is a bit louder. But I think the unifying factor is our understanding of each other. The Israelis have said that if you want to achieve results, it's better to tell stories, to share stories than to argue. And in terms of Suhasini's comment on the new tourism policy, for the benefit of those who don't know the background, since post-COVID, on September 23rd last year, all visitors have to pay STF, that's a sustainable development fee. If you're not Indian, you have to pay a minimum of US $200 per person per night. And if you're an Indian visiting Bhutan, it's a small fee of 1,200 rupees per night. And with the discussion on climate change, we feel to reduce carbon emission, and also because we're such a small country and the carrying capacity of Bhutan is so low that if we don't set the benchmarks high and don't attract discerning travelers who are sensitive to our culture and environment, it would be an irreversible process. And there are many cases in the region.
Right, and we all can actually learn from how Bhutan has thoughtfully used its tourism, and particularly, you know, in the region which has so many tourist hotspots. Ashok, do you want to weigh in on this very quickly, and then we're going to go to audience questions?
Very, very quickly. I mean, you have to bear in mind that when you deal with a poor relation tends to be very hypersensitive. So I don't think India means to ride roughshod over, but we are hypersensitive. That said, the last 30 years have been fantastic. I think Indian foreign policy has improved so much since the days of the infamous, what we call the Parippu drop, where they drop parcels of food. And we've never forgotten that or whatever. But it's hugely improved since then. And actually, India has dealt with us with great maturity in this last kerfuffle, because they also know that China waits in the wings. China comes in wherever India steps out. So it's a very tricky thing. I mean, that's all I'm going to say at the moment.
And I have heard it said before that at least the one good thing about China is it makes us better neighbors. In a sense. Can I go very quickly through to all of you, because I have my own answers to this question. But when you think of yourself in the South Asian entity, which is your favorite South Asian city? Prajwal?
Hampi in Karnataka.
Okay.
Yeah.
Any takers? Yeah. Ashok?
Well, I think I would have to say Gaul in Sri Lanka, but I do love
Understood.
India. I do love the cities in India.
I think
but
when you
Gaul,
look down from Gaul at the sea, you see all the way to Antarctica.
all the way to Antarctica, yeah.
Tshering.
Used to be the city of jeans. I spent my formative years.
Jind in Punjab, Haryana.
Delhi.
Oh.
Delhi.
Oh, the city of gins.
City of jeans. Sorry. Yes. City of jeans. I spent my formative years in Delhi, and back then there was no metro, no malls, and also very little pollution. But now I must admit it is the pink city of Jaipur. The reason being that it is, I think, the only place on the face of the planet where all authors, artists, and people with dissenting views are given the due respect. Their hard work and creativity is acknowledged.
Very, very interesting. I do have about 10 minutes for questions from all of you, and I can see with a show of hands there's a bunch of questions. So let's see if we can bunch them up or we take them one at a time. Why don't you start with the young gentleman over there?
Two quick questions. What do you all believe the South Asian voice represents in the writing ecosystem and community? And two, what thread do you believe unifies all the South Asian communities beyond geographical borders?
Can we get a few? There's a gentleman next to him.
Yeah, we have differences in terms of our own vested interests, but there is a porosity there in terms of the religio-philosophical tradition of cultural ideas that has spawned through 2,000 years. How much of that can be a way and a means to create dialogue?
Right, very interesting. There's a gentleman at the back who's waving very furiously.
I had the privilege of working in Nepal for 14 years and a similar number of years in Sri Lanka. I want to ask, and I have observed
You're a
that
true
there's,
South Asian.
yeah, there's one unifying factor on which I would like the panel to comment on. Something that brings us all together, Bollywood. It is the only thing where all the taxis in all these cities play our songs and bring them together. What is your comment on that?
I would say there are taxis in New York and Dubai that also come together. But there's a gentleman in the front with a question.
Suhasini, not because I know your father, but because I've been associated with this festival from the day of its inception. The founder of the festival, John Singh, is my cousin, or was my cousin. Since the beginning, this has been one of the best sessions I've ever heard here. Thank you, and thank you, three gentlemen.
For the speakers, really.
Yeah, and for you too.
Thank you.
But one thing I would like to say, Prajwal, you are Nepalese Indian. Do you know the deep connections Nepal has with Jaipur?
Yes, yes.
The late Maharaja Man Singh's elder brother was married to a Nepalese princess. She was a Shah. The Raja Sahib of Khetri, whose palace is now the Vivekanand Museum, his wife was a Rana. the Raja Sahib of Sikar was married to a Rana. Samod was married, his grandmother was from Nepal. So a lot of the Nepalese royalty and nobility, the Rana family, had deep bonds here.
Well, I'm not surprised, and the manner of your question, sir, just reminds me of the one thing that brings South Asians together. I can go to any part of the world, we'll get into a corner, and within 2 minutes, me and the Pakistani gentleman, the Bangladeshi lady, the Sri Lankan, the Bhutanese, the Nepalis, everyone has suddenly found their connections and who they know in each other's cities. I could only hope that we were able to travel much more in the region, that we were able to see much more of our region, that my children certainly were able to cross borders without necessarily thinking about the passports and the visas as well. Now, you've got some wonderful questions for you, so we're going to...
Can I put one to sharing? I was present in March 1964 at Phonsling when Jigme Dorji was assassinated. And to Sri Lanka, there's another Jaipur princess from Mandava who is married to a Sri Lankan.
Well, we've
So you
got
have it
all
all
the
there.
connections going.
Thank you. Sorry for,
I don't know. And there are some other questions as well, I think, that have come from the audience. If you'd like to take them on bringing together the South Asian, a very interesting one about whether our historical past can actually inform more dialogue in the future. And of course, the connections about from Sri Lanka and Nepal as well. Go ahead. Oh, I'm so sorry. You're behind a thing. Is there a question here? Oh, please go ahead. And then we really do have to stop.
As the three of you are here, you would also realize the fate that SARC has met. What has gone wrong with the SARC? SARC was something which was basically created to have a South Asian identity, and it has gone to dogs. What happened?
You know, there's a gentleman in the audience who can answer that question a little better. Former Foreign Secretary Shyam Saran is here, and he is really, traveled in the region quite a lot. But why don't you take some of the questions, and maybe after that we could ask you to come on. Go ahead, Prajwal.
The question about South Asian literary identity, that was... I'll try to answer that. See, it's a very, very tricky issue when you are a fiction writer and write about a community that has not been represented much in fiction, because you're often going to be seen as a spokesperson for the community. And that is extremely dangerous for you as a writer of fiction, because you are not a public relations brochure. You're right, you're creating this world where there are evil people, there are beautiful people, there are all kinds of people. So it can be a little tricky. Ashok, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I would stress on the fact of English being the common thread, because where we all, this is not to do our own languages down. We're very proud of our own languages and we hold them as banners of defiance. But precisely because we hold them up as paragons of our culture, in order for us to have a common ground, it is hugely important that we have an international language. Now, the fact that it is also a colonial language is extremely unfortunate. But why don't we call it Esperanto? Why don't we call it American? Or, well, no, that's unfortunate too. Let's call it what you will, but it allows us an individuality, and it allows there to be a certain wall between you and what you're saying, so that people don't misconstrue the sort of inherent prejudice that we all have.
Right. So Google needs to put in a sign that says English South Asian.
South Asian. South Asian.
So 13 years ago, in 2010, our queen, who is now the queen mother, invited the Indian ambassador in Thimphu and also Namita Gokhale for tea. Before they could finish tea, it gave the birth to the Mountain Echoes Literary Festival. So for the last 10 years, before COVID, Bhutan invited speakers from the neighborhood, from the international community, and we celebrated humanity.
That's a simple answer, and certainly I would urge you all for the next Mountain. When is the next Mountain Echoes?
August 3rd to August 5th, and all are welcome.
I would certainly, having actually attended the Mountain Echoes Festival, I would absolutely recommend it to all of you. I only have enough time to maybe ask Mr. Shyam Saran to come on. You've spoken about all the serious issues we want. Could we get a mic to him, please? To give us a sense of where you think India is in South Asia, and as the gentleman said, why we aren't able to come together as in a grouping.
Well, whether we like it or not, we are together. So, I mean, that is a reality that I don't think any one of us can get away from. I would only argue from my own experience that the point that was made about India's sensitivity to the kind of sentiments that there are amongst neighboring countries, that is fundamental. I think my own experience in Nepal, that Nepali friends are always looking out for that put down, which they think that the Indians always, are capable of. So it is not so much the reality of a symmetry which is there, but I think it is a question of how we actually project ourselves in the neighborhood. That is really important. And I would like to end by saying that I also am very much involved with climate change and environment. And it is my belief that South Asia, as we know it, is one ecological zone, one ecological entity. And there is no challenge, like, for example, the melting of the glaciers or the rising sea levels or the kind of, destruction of biodiversity which we are seeing across this region. We cannot deal with that without actually all the countries of South Asia working together. India may be the largest country, but there is no ecological challenge which can be dealt with by India alone. So if in our sort of writings, perhaps that sense of our ecological destiny, ecological future can also be reflected, that would be a huge, huge contribution.
So with these wise words, I should echo what Ashok said about us being that neighborhood where we actually are literally living next door to each other, and maybe one day can graduate to a more friendly and family-like neighborhood as well. You've been a great audience. Thank you so much for joining us. It's over to you, Sujata.